Good evening. I'm Dr. Vincent Baycoat. I'm the director of the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics. Welcome to our 2019 Moral Formation Lecture. We have a unique opportunity tonight with Jemar Tisby being here. That is to really let ourselves embrace the task of moral formation, particularly in relationship to how we think about history. Because when we are confronted with what history reveals to us, we have choices to make. And there are two choices that I'd like you to strongly consider tonight. One is that when you are being confronted with the facts, so to speak, of history, that you're willing to just sit there and take it on board rather than to give in to any temptations for resistance. Because sometimes, especially if we're talking about race, there's this strange thing that happens where people get a little nervous, a little fearful, and then they start to resist what they are hearing. And what I want you to do instead is to take up the challenge of courage and taking on board what you hear. And then the second challenge is to take on board the opportunity to let what you hear inform what kind of person you will choose to be when it comes to what kind of people we as Christians will be in this world. So tonight presents us with a great moral formation opportunity. And that's coming from, as I mentioned, Jemar Tisby, the author of The Color of Compromise. I first met Jemar, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, at a gathering of some other African-American leaders. And back then, he was just beginning to do things with what was called the Reformed African-American Network and with his Pass the Mic podcast. And there's been a lot of growth with that since that time. And it's a great privilege for us to have him here with us tonight. He is working on his doctoral degree in history from the University of Mississippi. He's given a lot of thought to the question about the role of the church in the United States in the face of race. And he spent many, many hours confronting what's there in the record. And some of that he will share with us tonight.
I feel like praying. Would you pray with me? God, you are the source of our strength. You are the strength of our life. Help us, Lord, tonight to not just listen attentively, but to elevate those who have been brought low because of the sin of racism and white supremacy, to give us eyes to see and ears to hear, hearts to feel and hands to work for the justice that you brought us through your Son, Jesus, on the cross and in the resurrection. As we labor and we strain for the day of Jesus' return, and as we pray even now that your kingdom would come and that your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, Lord, may it be so. In Jesus' name, amen. It was September 15th, 1963, the day of the Youth Day Sunday service at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were making the final touches on their white dresses in the church basement. And that's when the bomb exploded. It left a hole in the floor 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep, injured more than 20 other people, killed all 4 girls. Poor Cynthia was decapitated by the blast. Her parents could only tell it was their little girl by the ring she was wearing and the shoes on her feet. In the aftermath of the bombing, this act of racial terrorism, of course, people were outraged. People white and black, people not just in the United States, but the world over. How could such a horrendous act happen? condemned it, decried it. Murder. Young people at a church, no less. A day after the bombing, a young white lawyer named Charles Morgan Jr., he had a regularly scheduled talk, a previously scheduled talk to give in front of young white businessmen in the city. And in wake of the tragedy, he changed his message. And when he got up there to speak, he asked his listeners a question. Who threw that bomb? Who did it? Was it a Negro or a white? And his answer was, we all did it. Every last one of us, speaking before his white audience, is responsible or condemned for that crime, and the bombing before it, and a decade ago, we all did it. He went on and he said, the who is every little individual who talks about the niggers and spreads the seeds of his hate to his neighbor and his son. The jokester, the crude oaf, whose jokes rock the party with laughter. Then he turned his attention to the church. He said, did those ministers visit the families of the Negroes in their hour of travail? Did many of them go to the homes of their brothers and express their regrets in person or pray with crying relatives? Did they admit Negroes into the ranks of their church? What Charles Morgan Jr. was getting at was this idea of complicity. So, of course, there were plenty of Christians who actively created and supported a system of racism and white supremacy. The people who planted the dynamite, who hung the noose, who unleashed the bullets and created racist policies. But truth be told, that's a relatively small number of people in proportion to the general population. And when that is your definition of what a racist looks like, then it is too easy to exonerate ourselves of any of the racism that happens around us. You say, well, I'm not one of those people, so I must not be part of the problem. Those are the real racists. But what about everyone else? What about those whose silence, whose passivity, whose apathy, whose fear actually enabled those acts of racism? Did you know that Birmingham had already earned the nickname Bombingham, and there was a neighborhood called Dynamite Hill? This wasn't the first time it had happened. So how did we get there? It's not that each and every white Christian in America actively participated in acts of racial terrorism or overt bigotry. But I would argue a majority of Christians, at least a critical mass, didn't actively fight the racism running rampant in their communities. The truth is that the most egregious acts of racism, like a church bombing, occur within a context of compromise. So, wrote this book called The Color of Compromise. And because of the title, I'm actually surprised I don't get this question more often, which the title sort of invites, right? The color of compromise. What is then the color of compromise? Is it pink? Is it purple? Is it powder blue? Is it periwinkle? I have no idea what periwinkle looks like. I hear it's a color. Is it the color of compromise? No. I'm not often asked this question, but I'm going to answer it for you tonight. And I argue that the color of compromise is at least three colors. The color of compromise is green for the greed that goes along with racism and white supremacy. The color of compromise is white for the white supremacy that told a story of racial difference that put white people at the top and the center of society, while all other people of color were deemed marginal or other or lesser. And the color of compromise is red for the blood that accompanied the physical violence that was always necessary to maintain a system of greed and white supremacy. So, I'll talk about each one and I'll close with a call to action. Let me preface it by saying I'm going to use the words black and white. I'm going to use the word white supremacy and all of these things that are triggers in other contexts. But you're here, so we may as well be honest and upfront about it, okay? We're on a journey. And if you just walk with me through it, I promise at the end you will know more than when you started. Also, I could tell by your response when the choir was up here, you're a little tight tonight. You're a little rigid. I don't know why we didn't all stand. I don't know. But if talking about these subjects, I need an amen corner. And so if I say something that resonates with you, let me know. Say amen. Say, preach, brother. Say, oh, you're stepping on my toes now, or whatever it might be. But it's okay. We're going to go through this together. First, a little bit about me. This is the beginning of a conversation. So you're going to have a lot of questions, and I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to find out more. So this is some social media information. Goodness gracious. All right, so you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, both at Jemar Tisby. Two websites that will have some helpful articles to continue this conversation, thewitnessbcc.com and then jemartisby.com. The Witness, I'm president of the Black Christian Collective, and we have literally hundreds of articles by dozens of people, not just black, but all coming from a Christian perspective. And then jemartisby.com is more of some of my historical research and data on that end. We also have two podcasts where we continue this discussion. I don't mind if you take out your phone right now and subscribe to it. You can go to iTunes or you can go to SoundCloud or Fireside and pass the mic. I co-host with Tyler Burns, and its tagline is Dynamic Voices for a Diverse Church. Footnotes is a podcast I just launched earlier this summer. I talk about current events, especially politics, from my own black Christian perspective. So as I said at the beginning, this is the beginning of a conversation. If you want to learn more, those are some resources. Now, let's get into it. The color of compromise is green. So, James W.C. Pennington, who was a black minister and abolitionist in the 1800s, said this: the being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle, and the cart whip. Starvation and nakedness are its inevitable consequences. Do you know that the United States practiced not just slavery, but a specific form of slavery that was race-based, which meant if you were considered black, then you could potentially be enslaved? That because it was race-based, you were born into it. You weren't captured as a prisoner of war or something of that nature. From womb to tomb, you were enslaved because of the color of your skin. And then there's this other part. It was not only race-based, it was chattel slavery. Chattel means property. So what happened in chattel slavery is a person becomes property. A human being is commodified and valued for what they can produce for a plantation owner. Many people say that slavery was America's original sin. I think it might be more accurate to say that slavery was America's original symptom, and its original sin was greed. So, to break it down simply, in a capitalist system, your goal is to maximize your profit and to minimize your loss. If you've ever looked at a budget or been in charge of one, typically the biggest slice of the budgetary pie goes to wages and benefits and salary for your workers. So, if you want to cut costs and save money and increase your bottom line, the easiest way to do that is to reduce the salary, benefits, wages for your laborers. Or better yet, don't give them any at all. That's what happened with race-based chattel slavery. Plantation owners seeking to make a profit said we can make the most money by enslaving people, giving them the bare necessities of food and shelter and clothing, just enough to keep them productive and nothing more. That way, we enrich ourselves. Now, this isn't to say at all that racism doesn't exist on its own. Human beings never need any excuses to hate one another. We're pretty good at that on our own. But when you add money on top of it, it gives further incentive to otherize people because now you can justify their dehumanization. You can justify not paying them. This is why the Mississippi Articles of Secession say this. Because here, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce on the earth. What are they saying there? You can't take slavery away, the economy will collapse. So don't ever let anyone tell you that the Civil War was not fought over the issue of slavery. When people say, it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, I always say, well, the states' right to do what? To enslave people. And furthermore, why did it take the nation's bloodiest war to finally emancipate the slaves? Why was race-based chattel slavery so resilient? It's because it was profitable. There was money to be made. And people fought and died to maintain their comfort. Race-based chattel slavery turned a person into property, attempted by the strange alchemy of the market to transform a human being into a commodity. But Genesis 1:26 and 27 tells us that all people are made in the image and likeness of God, and you can't treat someone like an object. It's a heresy. But this is what persisted for centuries. This commodification of people is why they packed so many people onto slave ships. Most ships weren't created to carry hundreds and hundreds of passengers. They had to be retrofitted to transport that many people. And when they outfitted the ships to transport Africans to the coast of what became the United States, do you think they were thinking about the comfort of the passengers? No. They were treating human beings the same you would treat barrels or bushels or boxes. And the logic there is fit as many as you can as possible. Furthermore, they accounted for the deaths of some people. So they set off from the shore knowing good and well that because of the way they had designed the ship to pack as many people on board as possible without regard to hygiene or privacy or anything like that, that some people were going to die, and that was an acceptable cost of the transatlantic slave trade. You turned a person into property. Some of you know who this is. Olaudah Equiano wrote a biography of his time. He was kidnapped as a child from the area now known as Nigeria. He was of the Igbo tribe. He and his sister were both kidnapped at the same time. And he talks about what the chattel principle does to families. He wrote this: "The next day proved of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced, for my sister and I were then separated. While we lay clasped in each other's arms, it was in vain that we besought them not to part us, but she was torn from me and immediately carried away, while I was left in a state of distraction not to be described. I cried and grieved continually, and for several days I did not eat anything but what they forced into my mouth." Later in life, Equiano became a Christian. And as he's writing his autobiography, he's noticing that slave traders and people who are owning and holding slaves, they are Christians too. But as black Christians have always done, they saw through the hypocrisy of this slaveholder Christianity. He says this: "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God? who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you. There's another quote that I find helpful. It's by Forrest Wood. He says, cynical though it may sound, it's not an exaggeration to submit that the critical fact in determining who opposed slavery and who supported it was a consequence entirely of political and economic factors. All of the Christian conviction in the world could not dent the purse of one slaveholder. Talk about Christian complicity. That they valued political and economic gain over their religious faith and the principles and the morals and the ethics that their Savior taught them. In the book, I wrote that the only other R word more controversial than racism is reparations. So now immediately, we can debate how reparations would work, how to distribute them. Will it work? What's the best method to address the issue? That's valid. But what should not be up for debate is that for more than 2 centuries, enslaved black people labored and built the wealth of this country without financial compensation. And even after the Civil War and emancipation, the dream of 40 acres and a mule never materialized. Black people emerged from enslavement, but they remained in bondage to poverty, and true freedom remained a dream. Some stats for you. All total, students have $1.5 trillion in loan debt. That's all races. That's more than auto loans. That's more than credit card money that you owe. Student debt. But black people take on 85% more debt than white students because they don't have that generational wealth to draw upon. And we pay it back more slowly. We are specifically targeted by for-profit colleges and universities, and we have that lack of family wealth to draw on. So Pew Research reports that by 2013, white households had a median net worth of 13 times that of black households. So to me, you can't have a serious conversation about racial justice if we don't talk about economic justice. And guess what? You don't have to wait on the government to act. What if Christians decided to take the initiative? I'll let you ponder that. The color of compromise is green. The color of compromise is also white. One of the themes in the book is that racism never goes away, it just adapts. As long as the idea of white supremacy exists and persists, racism and racial inequality will remain. Racism is based on the underlying myth of white supremacy, or as pastor and author Daniel Hill describes it in his book, Whites Awake, the narrative of racial difference. In other words, the stories we tell ourselves about race. As long as that story remains the same, then we'll always have manifestations of racism. So, here's a part that helps us understand in this very sophisticated chart here, scientifically made. Racism never goes away, it just adapts. So the manifestations of racism look different in 1619 than they do in 1919 than they do in 2019. And so you can say there were 3 sort of major phases. This is obviously generalization, but there was the era of race-based chattel slavery, which was very overt, people in literal physical chains. Then there's the era of Jim Crow and legalized segregation, where still very overt, because you have signs over drinking fountains that say whites only and blacks only, and that black people have to go in the back of the building and are excluded and have to sit in the back of the bus, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're in this period that Emerson and Smith in their book Divided by Faith call a racialized society, whereas outcomes still largely fall along racial lines, even though legally we've taken away the words black and white and you can't legally discriminate based on race. Somehow we've still found policies and left structures in place that perpetuate racial inequality. The question is, after all this change, why hasn't it gone away? It's because of that underlying narrative of racial difference or white supremacy still remains the same. Now, when it comes to whiteness or white supremacy, it does at least three things. First, whiteness is a socially constructed meaning that doesn't have any basis in biology or the Bible, right? I say that because when I talk about whiteness, oftentimes people think I mean white people, white individuals. When I talk about whiteness, though, I'm talking about an ideology. I'm talking about socially constructed categories that have no basis in biblical ontology about who God says you are. I'm talking about what society has said you are because of what you look like. So when I say whiteness, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about John or Sally or Bill. I'm talking about this idea. See how we culturally code different things? So, one of the things that whiteness does is it creates this category of whiteness that then erases ethnicity. And I'm talking mainly for white people here. So originally when white people came to what became the United States, you were British or Irish or Scottish or Scandinavian or Czechoslovakian or whatever it might be. But then when you come to this country, you become white. And what happens is it has erased your nationality, it has erased your history, and what goes with that? The history of your country, your language, your food, the dances that go along with it. And what are you left with? You're left with whiteness. Whiteness, which is a racial and social construct. As an example of this, I went to seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, and it attracted students from all over the country, places like Ohio and Illinois. And when some white guys would first get there, you could tell they were not from Mississippi. But within a semester or two, all of a sudden they had grown these beards as best they could. They started wearing bow ties and seersucker. And I'm like, who are you? That is not your culture where you came from. But over time I realized that the South is one of the places where it's clearest for white culture, what it looks like, how it's embodied. And what happened was a lot of these young male white seminarians would come down to the South and see this entire culture and history associated with the Southern gentleman, and they would adopt that because it was a very clear and overt way of practicing culture. What they didn't do is go back to their Irish roots or their Italian roots. And so when we say we need to divest of whiteness, we're not saying there's something wrong with you as people. We're saying with this construct of whiteness, it has erased this beautiful, rich history and this diversity that you yourself have, even as a person who's considered white in this country. But then what happens, if you don't know that and you embrace this myth of whiteness, then what happens is, the second consequence is it creates this equal and opposite category of black. The narrative of racial difference or white supremacy says that people of African descent have inherently less dignity, less worth, less ability, and less of everything than white people. In between this black and white, if we think of it as a continuum or a spectrum, in between is everyone else, Native Americans, Latino and Latinas, Asian people. And even though people of different races and ethnicities may not be black, they're not white. Right? But the closer you can get to this standard of whiteness, the center of whiteness, the more acceptable you are culturally. And so here comes the myth of the model minority that many Asians deal with. And if you assimilate to the dominant culture, thank you. See, you can talk, it's all right. If you assimilate to the dominant culture, then you have less trouble. You can succeed, you can get promotions, you can get more money. But the moment you assert your distinctiveness and your ethnicity and your nationality, it becomes a problem. There's a difference between Latinos and Latinas who identify with a Central or South American country, or people who are light-skinned versus dark-skinned, people who speak with an accent or not. And to the degree that you can sort of tamp that down and seem more culturally white, the less problems you have in general, until something inevitably reminds people that you're not white. And then it's a problem. There's an article in the Harvard Gazette that says America's traditional racial hierarchy assigns the highest status to whites, followed by Asians, with Latinos and blacks at the bottom. Sometimes that switches based on different factors, but all of us are affected. So, what does this have to do with Christians? When we talk about white nationalism, that's been in the news a lot lately, I think it's also critical for us to remember the religious dimensions of it, and that there's something called white Christian nationalism that still persists. But it has roots, decades, even centuries old. So, most people don't realize there were 3 major iterations of the Ku Klux Klan. The first was right after the Civil War, when white male Southerners wanted to take back the South for the white man and supposedly protect white women from all these black men who were now free. The third iteration was during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, when blacks were making more progress in terms of civil rights. The second, and in many ways the most widespread manifestation of the Klan, came in the midst of the Jim Crow era. So in 1915, this movie comes out called Birth of a Nation. It was the first blockbuster film in U.S. history. It was a 3-hour-long black and white silent film. Made it to the White House. Woodrow Wilson showed this film, and it talked about the rise of the Klan, the rise of the KKK, as this noble thing against northern carpetbaggers and freed black people. And it made it to the White House. Woodrow Wilson showed it to audiences in the White House, and he liked it so much, he said it was like writing history with fire, with lightning, rather. And so, think of this romanticized idea of the South. Think of Gone with the Wind, right? These beautiful plantation mansions, these beautiful white people, plantation owners, and belles of the South, and then the happy black slave, content in their position of servitude. That was the idea behind the film. Well, the film proved so popular that it actually spurred the rebirth of the KKK. So on Thanksgiving Day in 1915, a former Methodist circuit rider, a preacher, assembled a group of white men to hold a ceremony. They ascended to the top of Stone Mountain, the front of which is covered with Confederate heroes. And they did a ritual taken from Scotch-Irish lore. They erected a big wooden cross and they burned it. Then, they also constructed an altar of stone and placed on it 2 objects, an American flag and a Bible. The Bible was open to Romans chapter 12, a chapter that states, among other things, be devoted to one another in love. The cross, the flag, the Bible, an altar, white, Christian, nationalism. All those elements there, and to an extent still there in certain pockets today. The color of compromise is white. Lastly, the color of compromise is red. In many ways, this is the hardest section, because one of the things we don't often talk about is the violence associated with greed and white supremacy. So, I warn you, it's very graphic. Not only do I talk about lynching, but I talk about the gendered violence enacted toward black women of rape. I do this not to be sensationalistic, but because if we don't recognize in brutal detail what happens when you have a system of racism and white supremacy and greed, if we don't understand how that affects people physically, then we won't act with the urgency that the problem requires. White supremacy says that in order to maintain power, in order to maintain control, at the end of the day, violence is necessary. Physical violence has always been necessary in the maintenance of white supremacy. This is a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. He says, it's hard to face this, but all your phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great force upon the body. Now listen, the image of God can never be erased, but it can be defaced. It can never be completely destroyed. And black people know this. When we experience racism and oppression, we know something's not right. We know that we don't deserve to be treated this way simply because of the way God made us and the bodies he gave us. And so then what happens is you start to resist oppression. But guess what? That's not good for the bottom line or the status quo. So how do you put down this spirit in all of us that rises up to resist injustice because we know deep down that we're worthy of dignity, we're worthy of respect? How do you stamp that out when you have the thumbprint of God on you? The only way you can do it, ultimately, is through violence. So that's what happens. How does this myth of white supremacy keep control? How do you make sure that myth persists? You rape, you lynch, you shoot, you choke, you murder. You instill fear. So, in 1904, a lynching occurred. We're not sure of the details, as is often the case in situations like this. We know it was over a bit of a love triangle between 3 black people, 2 black men who were sharecroppers, and 1 black woman. The argument got so heated between the 2 men that one of the men went and got the plantation owner to basically come and force this other black sharecropper to give over his wife or lover. We're not sure what happened exactly. The plantation owner and this one black sharecropper went to the other black sharecropper's house. What ended up is the black sharecropper and the white plantation owner were killed by this other black sharecropper. Now, if this black sharecropper had killed another black sharecropper, there might have been a beating or a job loss, but since he killed a white man and a rich white man, it was an automatic death sentence. So this man, Luther Holbert, goes on the run with his beloved Mary Holbert. They hide out in the swamps. Mary disguises herself as a man, but there's a posse of white people who have bloodhounds and everything, and after 3 days, they catch up with them. Now, you know how the story ends, but how you get there is a horror of inhumanity. So they didn't do the lynching right away. They waited till Sunday. Why? So more people could come. 1,000 white people show up to witness this spectacle. And they chose the location for the lynching strategically. It wasn't just in a field somewhere. It wasn't even in the middle of the town square. It was on the property of a black church. Why do that? Because the black church has always been a center for activism, for organizing, and for dignity for black people. And so if you do this lynching, this act of racial terror on the grounds of a black church, that means there's nowhere that's safe for you. So the people assembled Sunday afternoon at this black church. First, the white murderers cut off each of the fingers and toes of Luther and Mary Holbert and gave them out as souvenirs. I often wonder what became of those fingers and toes. Are they sitting in someone's attic somewhere? Did someone years later come across these desiccated pieces of human body and say, what is this? Just toss it in the trash? Then they beat the bodies of Luther and Mary Holbert so mercilessly that one of Luther Holbert's eyes hung from its socket. The Vicksburg Evening Post at the time reported the most excruciating form of punishment consisted in the use of a large corkscrew in the hands of some of the mob. The instrument was bored into the flesh of the man and woman in the arms, legs, and body, and then pulled out the spirals, tearing out big pieces of raw, quivering flesh. Finally, the Holberts, who were still alive after all of this torture, were taken to a pyre. The white men forced 2 black men to drag them over to these stacks of wood. They burned Mary first so that Luther could see his beloved killed before his very eyes. Then they burned him. That's just one instance of the nearly 5,000 recorded lynchings that we know about. The color of compromise is red. But the violence took different forms for different people, in particular for women. On September 3rd, 1944, Reese Taylor was on her way home from late-night worship at Rock Hill Holiness Church in Abbeville, Alabama. Historian Danielle McGuire wrote that Taylor had been walking with 2 other churchgoers when a green sedan filled with 7 young white men pulled to a stop on the road, and holding her hostage at the point of a gun, they accused Taylor, who had been with her companions at the church all day, of stabbing a white man earlier that night in another location. They ordered her into the back of a car, drove her to a secluded pecan grove, told her to get them rags off. Then 6 of them proceeded to rape her. After that, a civil rights activist named Rosa Parks took up the case, and the Chicago Defender, a black newspaper, called it the strongest campaign for equal justice to be seen in a decade. Unfortunately, crimes such as the one Reese Taylor suffered had been an all too common feature of American life stemming back to the earliest days of slavery. In the Jim Crow era, rape persisted as a sexualized form of racial terror. Women were targeted for reasons as varied as retribution for perceived offenses to drunken fits of lasciviousness. As civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer would later explain, a black woman's body was never hers alone. And just to contextualize this, it's not that long ago. Reese Taylor only just died on December 18th, 2017. Now, I wish I had time to go into more detail about the origins of the police force, but let me just say that these contemporary protests against police brutality are a continuation of historic attempts to assert the value of black lives in the midst of a society that has constantly devalued black life. To say the phrase Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that only black lives matter. It means that black lives matter too. The hashtag, which says so much with so few words, it's a necessary response to the poison pill of violence enacted on black bodies to this day. To say Black Lives Matter is to protest against police brutality, to protest prisons that don't have working heating systems in the midst of a polar vortex, to protest lynchings and rapes in the Jim Crow era, to protest the fact that black women continue to die in maternity-related deaths at 3 times the rates of white women, to say that Black Lives Matter is to protest against the myriad ways that the American society has constantly said that white lives matter more and black lives are expendable. The color of compromise is red. So I write in the book that The Color of Compromise is a book about the past, but it's really about the present and the future of the church. In light of all this greed, the green, that stands for the greed of racism and white supremacy, in light of the white, that stands for this narrative of racial difference, in light of the red, that stands for the violence that supports these systems, what do we do? What do we do as believers who disagree with this, who are horrified at this? Well, the last chapter of the book is called The Fierce Urgency of Now, and it comes from this speech from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And rather than just quote him, Let's hear from King himself.
We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
Now is the time. Now is the time. Now is the time. The fierce urgency of now. What a powerful phrase. Urgency means it's right now. It's immediate. It's insistent. You can't ignore it. But it's a fierce urgency. It grips you. You can't breathe until you do something about it. When? Not later, not soon, but now, the fierce urgency of now. Now, that was 1963, more than half a century ago, but in many ways, we could still say that when it comes to racial justice in America, and especially the church, we need to respond to the fierce urgency of now. So what do we do? How do we do this? Well, this is not the final answer, but this is one answer. A framework called the Arc of Racial Justice. It stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. And as we think about the arc of racial justice, it's not a linear process. So you don't go from awareness to relationships to commitment and then you're done. It's a constant process. And one informs the other, and you're never done. Even the staunchest, most fierce civil rights activist is still developing awareness, is still developing relationships, is still constantly committing to action. But I think these three components are helpful because the most frequent question I get at events like these is, what do we do? And I used to just give this sort of smattering of answers. We'll try this, you could do that, you could do that. This is helpful to at least keep these things in tension. You can almost think of it as head, heart, hands. So a lot of us, we focus, even fixate on the awareness end. Now, the good news is we live in the information age, so information about race and racial justice has never been more accessible. You can read books, you can read articles, a couple of places to start. Here's the practical aspect, so take notes if you want. Read the letter from a Birmingham jail, one of the best works of 20th century American political theology out there. It's only about 12 pages long, but every sentence, every line, every paragraph is pithy, full of wisdom and challenge. I encourage you to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, if you haven't already. And there's a newer project, the 1619 Project, led by investigative journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, who assembled dozens of historians and artists and other people to write about 1619, the year when 20 and odd Negroes were forcibly brought to the coast of colonial Virginia in what is often regarded as the start of what became race-based chattel slavery. I encourage you to watch documentaries like 13th about the 13th Amendment and the rise of mass incarceration, or Ava DuVernay's latest, The Haunting When They See Us, about the Central Park Five, now the Exonerated Five. There's all kinds of resources that you can use to build awareness. At this point in history, there's really no excuse. One of the things I encourage you to do specifically is to look at history, the story of how we got here. Start locally. What names are on the buildings on campus? Who are these people? What about this community? When did it begin? How did it begin? Why do we have who's here? Whose land was it first? Not mine, not Europeans. Or start with something you think you're already familiar with, like the civil rights movement. It wasn't until my 30s that I read the first full-length autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. I knew the quotable king. I didn't know his life from birth to death, birth to murder, I should say. Start with something you think you know and be surprised by what you don't. Also, one last thing on awareness, read the book Divided by Faith by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. I think that's very helpful because it discusses white evangelical beliefs about race in particular. Now, let's say you are beginning this journey of awareness. You can't just have all this head knowledge. You have to have relationships with people who are different. All reconciliation is relational at the end of the day. All reconciliation is incarnational. So when God wanted to reconcile God's self with humanity, God didn't send an email or a tweet. He sent his son, a person who took on flesh. Why? To identify with us in our sufferings and express solidarity with us. What it takes to reconcile humankind to God is not fundamentally different in terms of relationships than it is to reconcile one person with another. We need each other. And for white people especially, it's hard to understand experiences of racial and ethnic minorities if you don't have a person who can put a face on injustice. So you can read about this stuff all you want. You can watch as many documentaries and movies and shows as you want, but until you're sitting across from someone who you care about and who you know, who's experienced injustice, it won't become real to you. It won't become urgent to you. A word to people of color, and especially my black brothers and sisters. We have to take care of ourselves too. So these relationships are exhausting. Why? Because we constantly have to explain our existence to other people who don't understand it. And some days, it's just not the day. But for a long time, I felt guilt over that. Like I was being a bad Christian or somehow divisive if I didn't want to explain the racial trauma once again to someone else. But I want you to hear from someone that it's okay to take a break. It's okay to pull back. It's okay to take care of yourself. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And for my white brothers and sisters, it's not saying don't ever ask people of color about their lives or their experiences. It's just saying leave space for them to have time. And there's a whole bunch of work you can do to find out stuff before you ask your friend. One of my favorite answers to these questions about race is just 2 words: Google it. It's out there. But here's the problem, especially among many white evangelicals. The problem is racism is one person not liking someone else. It is individual, it is relational. And so if that's the problem, what's the solution? Well, I treat other people nicely. I have friends across the color line. I tell you, some of my best friends are black. I just had a cup of coffee with somebody. We just broke bread together. That's great. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying that's necessary but not sufficient. So all the cups of coffee in the world aren't going to do a thing about mass incarceration. You can have all the potlucks you want, and it's not going to close the racial wealth gap. So the question is, what do you do about racism that has been inscribed into policy? About inequality that is built into institutions? That's the commitment aspect. Let me give you some very practical things. Number one, find out who your local district attorney is. These are prosecutors who have immense power in the criminal justice system. They're elected officials, but most people don't vote. But prosecutors have the power of sentencing to suggest a sentence. They can also suggest plea deals. And what prosecutors often run on is their conviction record, 90%, 95%. Well, you know what they can count as convictions? When people take a plea deal. So you have a poor person, often black or brown, caught up in the criminal justice system, often for a petty crime. A prosecutor comes to them and says, listen, you can go to trial and risk 10 years in prison if you lose, or you can take this plea deal, get 2 years in prison and 2 years probation. You're frightened. You don't see other options. You just want to get out of jail. So you take the plea. But now you're in the system and caught up in what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. But Christians can take action simply by knowing who your local district attorney is, finding out their platform, and pushing for reform. Another thing is voting rights. A lot of Christians, especially white Christians, get real nervous when you talk about politics. I don't care. I mean, I do, but I don't, right? You can't talk about justice without talking about policies. Policies are enacted through politics. But the ideal of a democracy of one person, one vote has never been secure. And even now, they are closing or moving polling stations. Other countries have a national holiday when it's time to vote so that everyone can get access. But now there are long lines where you have to miss work, and if you're an hourly wage worker, that's a huge blow. And you don't have to be Republican or Democrat. All you have to do is believe in democracy to promote voting rights. That's something that we should all be able to get behind, structurally and politically. And then, of course, look at your own institutions. Where are you getting students? Where are you recruiting them from? What networks do you have? Are we still saying, well, we couldn't find a person of color to fill this role? That's a structural problem. That's a policy problem. So I've talked about the color of compromise being green, being white, being red. I've talked about the arc of racial justice and what do we do about this problem of racism and white supremacy. But when it comes to fighting racism, I don't believe we have a how-to problem, but a want-to problem. We know what we can do about racism, or we know where we can find answers. We can go on the internet, we can read books, we can talk to people. What we lack is the will. What we lack is the courage to fight racism with the urgency that the problem requires. The question is not how to fight racism, but will you fight it? The time is now and long past for a revolution of courage in the American church and the nation. You know, people often say that if I were alive during the civil rights movement, I would have marched with King. I would have boycotted, I would have sat in, I would have gone on the freedom rides, I would have been part of the solution. Well, you can say that all you want, but brothers and sisters, we're in the midst of another wave of the civil rights movement. It never ends. And what you do now tells me what you would have done then. So don't pretend you would have been a part of it half a century ago if you're not part of the movement right now. Brothers and sisters, the question again is not how to fight racism. The question is, will you fight it? Thank you.
Well, very nice.